Welcome to the Tennis Junkies Pod, the tennis hub for all things rackets, string, coaching, interviews, and more. Hey there, fellow tennis junkies. Today, we're going to be interviewing my dad, Travis Pipkin. He's been a tennis parent now for as long as I've been a tennis player. Actually, we'll kind of get into the minute details of when he became a tennis parent in this upcoming episode. But yeah, I wanted to interview him. It was actually my girlfriend's idea, and he seemed to jump at the idea and the thought of being interviewed by me. He's been a huge supporter of all my tennis endeavors, from me first picking up a racket to me starting a tennis podcast. It was actually his idea. So yeah, super glad I get to talk with my dad. He's always been super supportive of me. Could never ask for anything more. And yeah, I think it'll be really helpful. This interview will be really helpful for tennis parents out there, and even tennis players to kind of get a better look into maybe why your parents are watching you and why they do the things they do whenever you're in competition, etc. So yeah, hope you guys enjoy it. Let's get right into it. Hey there, tennis junkies. Today we're with my dad, Travis Pipkin, and I'm going to be asking him different questions related to being a tennis parent, things that he has observed about the tennis, the junior tennis programs for USTA and UTR, and all sorts of things like that. So the first question that I have for you is, before I expressed any interest in tennis, which if people don't know, I started tennis at like 7th grade, something like that. What prior tennis knowledge did you have?
First of all, thanks for the invitation to be on your Tennis Junkies podcast. As they say, thanks for having me. I think for this first one, really, the truth is I had virtually none. I had no real experience as a player. I really hadn't watched any live tennis to speak of growing up, things like that. I had watched a fair amount on TV. So, I mean, I was familiar with names like Sampras and Navratilova and Chris Everett. And I kind of knew what the four major tournaments were across the world. Watched some of the Wimbledon tournaments and US Open and things like that, but no experience as a player, kind of the ins and outs of the game.
Okay, cool. So whenever I first started playing, we took me first to the Richland Tennis Center, which is super close to our house. And I first started taking group lessons and that sort of thing, but I wouldn't call that taking it serious in any way. I was just kind of like learning what topspin meant and what like the basic continental grips are and stuff. So what were your first thoughts whenever I asked you to start taking private lessons, not the group lessons?
Yeah, that was some interesting conversations because, I personally, as a parent, as a tennis parent, I was really a fan of the way that Richland Tennis Center put together their programs. And I really felt like the group experiences that you had were really positive. I can tell you're having a lot of fun with that. It was a pretty low stress environment. It wasn't a whole lot of expense per hour. I thought it was reasonably priced. I could tell you really loved to do that. And it's also fun for me just to be able to see you interacting with other players and other coaches, and the mix of the exercise plus the social aspect of the game plus the player development was really cool. But when you first showed an interest in private lessons, I really had a couple of thoughts that came to mind. First of all, one was it was a pretty big step up in price per hour. So, I mean, a little bit of sticker shock, I guess you could say. And then the other thought was, I wasn't sure if you would really stay interested for a full hour, and if it was just one-on-one for that much time, quote unquote, that much time. So as I recall, on the first one that you took with Preston, we actually split the difference where you took a half-hour lesson. And my big takeaway from that was he ran you all over that court until you just about passed out. So I'm not sure you could have made it for a full hour, even if I was willing to pay for a full hour. But honestly, on balance, when the dust settled and we got the water and everything else after that, I was sold on the concept. I could tell that when you have a coach that knows what they're doing, that it's worth the money to get in there and get that individualized, customized instruction, and got a really good relationship with your coaches ever since then. And the other thing I would say too is that, different from the group drills that you had, a really good private lesson isn't just about how to hit certain shots. A really good one's going to also include when in the course of a game or a point to hit certain shots, which I thought was hugely valuable.
Yeah, I vividly remember taking the half-hour private with Preston. And for people who don't know, I'm from Texas, and it's insanely hot and insanely humid. And the only real sports experience I had prior was like indoor basketball. And like I did some baseball like a while back, but really it was just like indoor basketball. So it was AC and it was like kind of cold whenever you were playing. So that was a whole different ball game whenever I hit like 7 times as many balls in half the amount of time. And yeah, I vividly remember almost passing out at the end of that. Okay, so at what point in my tennis journey, which has now been like 7 years, almost 8, something like that, what point did you consider yourself a tennis parent?
That's kind of a tough question for me because I'm not sure I really even do today. I just kind of consider myself your parent along the journey that you're on. But just like you mentioned, I mean, you played baseball and you played basketball growing up. I didn't really consider myself a baseball or basketball parent. I was just a parent that was along for the ride for some of those games. Um, but the tennis experience did take a little bit of a different turn. When you initially showed interest in your experience with tennis, the first part of it was kind of similar with the whole drills aspect. But as a parent, the real difference from the team sport for me was you and I could just go jump in the car and find an open tennis court and play. That's not really something we could do per se as like a baseball kind of effort or basketball necessarily. It's just a different sort of dimension. So to me, that was fantastic. I love that. It's one of my favorite aspects about your tennis journey is that we actually got to do some of that together until you got too good to play with me. But it wasn't too long before, we did the father-son thing. We had a lot of those matches. But then when you started beating me very consistently, you graduated to the higher level players to be able to actually get competitive partners. So that's how it should be. So, I mean, to me, I guess you could say that I became a tennis parent through the process of actually getting to play with you in the sport that you were growing to love. But in terms of when I really thought of myself as a tennis parent, I guess that probably came after you'd already played, I guess, probably a few competitive matches when I finally understood how the serving and the switching and the scoring worked for a tiebreaker. Because it was just a mystery to me for such a long time. It's kind of embarrassing to admit. But once that mystery was solved, then I felt like I'd arrived as a tennis parent.
I find it interesting that you say that it's on a tiebreak thing, because for me, whenever I would consider you a tennis parent, meaning that you weren't just a parent of an athlete, but a tennis parent, was whenever you first started tracking my matches on your phone with the score. Whenever you would, and now I say that and people think, oh, they're keeping track of the score. And then if there's a problem, you correct it. No, no, no. Like you were tracking errors, serves, first serve, second serves, return, like literally you were tracking stats like we were at Wimbledon. And that's whenever I considered you a tennis parent. So I thought for sure that was going to be your answer for that.
We had fun double lap.
Yeah. So what has been your favorite thing about being a tennis parent?
I'd say hands down, my favorite thing about being a tennis parent, while you're in middle school and high school, were all the opportunities that it gave us to spend time together. I mean, bottom line, that's really it. That was the coolest part for me. So it started off just being able to watch you at drills and things like that up at Richland Tennis Center. But then we started playing all those matches together like we're talking about. And then when we started playing tournaments, we traveled around the tennis centers all over the Dallas-Fort Worth Metroplex, at least 1 or 2, maybe even 3 times a month on the weekends. And then we branched out to broader spaces across Texas, including we went down, Waco several times, and Tyler and Houston and Austin and San Antonio, Abilene, Wichita Falls, all these cool places. Sometimes the rides back from the tournament weren't necessarily as enjoyable as the rides to the tournament, but as a tennis parent, I wouldn't trade those experiences for anything.
Yeah, that is one thing that I miss. And if I do make the college team this year, will be interesting to travel with people in a tennis setting that's not either like my doubles partner at the time or with you. And even like for high school matches, whenever we played like the 3 total that were away or whatever, even like for state or for district, like you still would come to Waco and watch. And even in like the ITAs that I would play, you'd still come and watch. Like I can, besides being here in college, I can think of one tournament that I went to that you and mom weren't there for, or you or mom weren't there for. So that was one thing, is that you were super involved with just watching me play, which I took for granted. So number 5 is, what would be your least favorite thing about being a tennis parent? It doesn't necessarily need to be like about me or your experience with me, but just in general in the tennis world, what has been your least favorite thing?
Well, I think for me, you've already kind of alluded to this with your the lesson with Preston. I mean, to me, the least favorite part about being a tennis parent in Texas is the heat. It gets pretty brutal for a good chunk of the year. So, it's true that tennis is a year-round sport, which is fantastic, but it's also true that here in Texas, summer is kind of a year-round thing as well. And 98% of your matches were outside. I mean, there were a few times we went down to T-Bar M or someplace where it's indoors, but that's pretty rare for us in this part of the country. So for me, the recipe for success in that situation would be sunglasses, sunscreen, an umbrella or a really big hat, and plenty of water and ice too. Would be nice to have that available when needed. So it can get tough on the sidelines, but obviously it's way, way more challenging when you're on the court running around 100 miles an hour in the 100-degree heat. But for me, that was the toughest part.
Yeah, the heat is brutal, and I think of like the big tennis states being like Florida, California, Texas, like those being the big places, just because it is playable outside year round. But I vividly remember the tournament that we played where it snowed and they had us play with the snow. And I thought to myself that was real ironic because of the amount of times I thought to myself, it'd be so great to like play in the cold. And that was a way worse experience than having to play in the extreme heat whenever you can't feel any of your limbs and you're trying to, hit a serve or a return. But
yeah, it was at Trinity Valley High School in Fort Worth, and one of your opponents actually was out there in literally a t-shirt and shorts.
Yeah,
with the snow coming down, it was crazy.
because if you wore like long sleeves and warm clothes, you got hot really fast, and you take it off, and you started freezing. And yeah, I just vividly remember looking over at you and mom, like not moving like statues with like 14 blankets, and that was a terrible experience. I couldn't believe they actually played that. So kind of shifting into a little bit more of you giving advice to other parents. So many people may not know this, but I was a brat once it turned into me wanting really, really badly to be able to play college tennis or play at a very high level. Mainly whenever I had an unrealistic view of playing college tennis, like I thought to myself, yeah, I'm going to play for Baylor. I'm going to go play for TCU. And I was like 4 UTR or whatever it was. And I needed like to triple my UTR in the span of 2 years. But I did go through a racket breaking phase. So what sort of advice would you give other tennis parents when it comes to handling their own kids' poor attitudes on the court? Not necessarily racket breaking, but just poor attitudes toward themselves, not toward the opponents. Because I feel like out of all the matches I've played, I can maybe think of one that I was directly rude to an opponent that I played, and it was probably warranted. I can't think of that many when I was mean to them more so than hard on myself.
Yeah, well, that's a great question. And I really wish somebody had been able to educate me 6 years ago when we started the journey. I would have done some things differently. But I would say that, since I didn't really have any experience as a tennis player growing up, I didn't really have any appreciation literally for just how challenging the sport is, not only on the physical side, but also on the mental side. And the momentum swings you go through in the course of a match or even a game potentially, it's just really kind of off the charts. So that's especially true when you're in a situation, which is often the case, where it's your opponent, not the official or an umpire that's responsible for calling balls in and balls out. The lack of awareness that I had led me to contribute, I think, to you being underprepared for those kind of situations, for that aspect of the game. And I understand now, partly from watching you and your opponents, but also partly from my own experience playing in a couple of UTRs myself along the way, of just how challenging those kind of things really are. So it's really difficult to manage emotions. So I have a great respect for people that can do that and do it well, because it's not easy, especially when you're trying so hard to win. So I have a couple things to share in terms of kind of my advice for parents kind of jumping in on this journey. The first thing, because I've seen a lot of examples, I think, of people kind of taking a wrong turn in this area. But first of all, just check in with your player to really figure out if he or she wants to do this. I mean, are they really in it because they want to do it? Or are they in it because they just think that you want them to do it? You didn't really start playing tournaments until you were a teenager, but a lot of the kids you were playing against have been playing for a very, very long time. some of whom already burn out or on the verge of burning out by the time they got to junior high and high school. So I think it's really important to make sure players really want to be there and compete. It's not just doing it for somebody else's whim. Second thing I would say is, as a parent, I think we need to get educated on the rules of the game and understand, not only the rules of how to call balls and strikes, so to say, or how a tiebreaker actually works, but also what the etiquette expectations are, and make sure that your player is educated on that too, including the etiquette piece. So the third and last thing I'd say is just to have that conversation, maybe several, with your player about setting expectations on the boundaries for where the behavior is going to be, especially when they're on the tennis court. I think that having those kind of boundaries understood and agreed to before the match starts or before the tournament starts, really, because that's where the pressure packed situation is. If you get those things squared away ahead of time, that's going to go a long way, I believe, towards setting your player up for success, because you really kind of understand where those boundaries are. And speaking of boundaries, I mean, as a parent, I think that works for us too. There's plenty of examples I could recall of parents behaving badly in a tennis match. So I think it's our responsibility too to understand what the expectations are for us. Not everything that we believe is going to be helpful and supportive for our player really is going to come across that way. I learned that lesson a couple of times. So even if you think you're doing the right thing, it may come across as a negative. So it's better to get that thing squared away first, so you can better support your player.
Yeah, and I think one thing with the dealing with emotion is it's going to be so personalized to each player, because like for me, I have had such a like roller coaster in terms of like how to handle myself while I play. And while some people that I like to watch on the tour reflect the way that I act, whenever I look away from that, it's like I played some tournaments where I told myself, like, I'm going to literally be as stone faced as I possibly can. And I played terrible doing that because I try to take it so serious. And then I'm like, okay, fine. I'm just going to act like I don't even care. And then I just like tank the whole thing without even realizing what I'm doing. And then I try and find like a happy medium. And then I get too frustrated, or I get too amped, or I make too many jokes, or I'm too hard on myself. And it's like finding that balance as a tennis player is like pretty close to impossible, even whenever you look at the pros, to find like the perfect medium of emotion to show, not to show, to feel, to not feel. And I mean, like, I think of so many pro players out there where like, I think of Nadal is probably the best, most mentally stable player on the tour, never broken a racket, never had a meltdown or a hissy fit. But I think to myself of like Federer or Djokovic, where they've had more than enough of their own hissy fits, but they've also learned to kind of balance it their own way. And I think with me being a big fan of like college tennis, and the better that I got and the more competitive that I wanted to be, and the more college tennis that I watched, it made me want to be more amped and more like positively like screaming come ons and fist pumps and things like that. But then you would get on such a high adrenaline high that you mess something up and now you're swearing, throwing your racket, smashing balls out of the court. And it's like trying to find that medium as a player is so difficult. But as a parent, trying to not be too positive on one thing or too negative on another thing, it's a whole nother scale that becomes really difficult, because it's hard to have a kid fist pumping and that they shouldn't be, even though they won the point. Maybe it was a stupid way to win a point or whatever. You as a parent shouldn't necessarily cheer that on, but you also shouldn't view it as a negative thing. So you got to find like a perfect balance between that. And then I'm looking over at you on the sideline, and it's like virtually impossible to have this massive like wheel of emotion flying all over the place. And then you got to deal with the opponent too. So overall, in total, with my just constant all over the place for tournaments and practice and whatever, like I think you did a pretty good job, considering with all things considered. I think most players typically lean one way or the other in terms of showing emotion or not showing emotion. But for me, I think what made it hard on you and Mom is I was either way too far one way or way too far the other way, and it was different every day. Like I can think of so many tournaments where like one match I'll play and I'm silent and I lose and I'm fine. And then the next match I play, I'm super amped and I'm super pumped. And I end up winning pretty well. And yet I acted way worse than whenever I did the other way. And then it's just like, I just can never find a balance personally. And so like, I think of the one tournament that I played where I had smashed a ball against the back fence, like insanely hard. And after the match, mom got all mad at me and was like, you should never do that again, ever. And then I played the next match and I did the same thing and it nailed the pole that was holding up the fence and it came back and smacked me like right in the chest, like full speed.
Right.
And I think that was the first time that it like quote unquote hit me in the face that I was like, man, like I got to find a mid ground. And that made me kind of realize how difficult it is for all tennis parents and even just all sports parents, but tennis in particular with the way emotion works and everything. So I do think that you handled it well. I don't think that many kids turn into racket breakers. That again, I think I was just on either one side of the spectrum or the other side. But yeah, that was definitely probably the most difficult part of my tennis journey was learning that regardless of anything in the whole 8 years that we've played, it's probably me handling emotion and then you guys figuring out the way to handle mine. And anyway, that was whenever I made these questions, that was the one question that I asked. And I'm like, I feel like this answer for me and what you guys did is going to be so drastically different from what most parents deal with. But yeah, maybe it's more common than I think it is, but that was good. So from your perspective, kind of shifting to the junior tennis with UTR, USTA, and that sort of thing. And with me doing professional tennis management and working the jobs that I've worked, you have, I think, a much deeper inside look into tennis as a whole on both pro side, equipment side, director side, coach. Like you have a lot more knowledge than probably 80% of tennis parents, I would say. So from what you've experienced and seen, what would you change in the junior tennis space? For example, tournament direction, how the UTR system works, tournament fees, and how can that improve the sport and outreach to younger players?
Yeah, thanks for the question. It is kind of interesting because I do have a lot of experience in this area, but it may be very different from other people that are doing the same kind of things in different parts of the country. In our case, I have a lot more experience with UTR type tournaments that you played, as opposed to the USTA tournaments that are out there. You played several of them, but not nearly as many, I think, as you did on the UTR side. So I think for me as a parent, I love the availability and the affordability, frankly, as well as the predictability associated with those UTR tournaments. So the ones that are run here in North Texas, they're set up as everybody's guaranteed 3 matches unless somebody's a no-show. And so that's good that you're going to get at least 3 matches out of it. And then also they generally would take place in one day. I mean, it's 2 days max, but from the very beginning, you know exactly when all 3 of your match times are supposed to happen, or generally that's the case in most of the tournaments you went to, the way they were run here. And to me, it just came across as a really super user-friendly kind of format, both for the players and for the parents. So I would love to see an increase in the availability of UTR tournaments across the country, frankly. I think it's a great way to get people introduced to the sport in a way that is very approachable as far as trying to get into competitive tennis. So and the way that the rankings work, you generally are supposed to be grouped with people who are pretty close to ability level as you. Of course, it's a bit of a toss up in your first few because you don't have a record yet, but you can get into the group pretty quickly. So a suggestion that I would absolutely love to see some type of instructional video or a video series, either from UTR or USTA, on a theme of something like before you play your first tournament. Things to know before you walk on the court for the first time in a competitive type situation, just to get some things out there about the fundamentals of the game, the fundamentals of the way the competition works for kids that are just graduating from like the drills or private lessons into a real, no kidding, competitive environment for the first time. If I remember this right, there's typically a high number of players who stop playing in organized tournaments after just their first 1 or 2 experiences. That was a huge thing I think David would talk about quite a bit at Richland. So that it's really important for tournament directors and all to create a good positive experience first time out, which is tough if you're going to lose. But I mean, there's a way to to get people prepared mentally, I think, for what to expect, and I think that would go a long way. On the other hand, I do think that for many players, the emphasis on ratings, especially on the UTR side, it can become counterproductive, I think. So this just seems to be, maybe it's kind of dramatic for me to say this out loud, but I think in many cases it results in a type of like dehumanizing players specifically and the sport in general. Because if a player can use it as a motivator to get better, I think that's great. I'm trying to increase my UTR score or rating. But if a player sees that he or she is like a 5.3, and on this next match, I'm going to go play a 5.4. Well, the temptation could be that, well, number one, I'm likely to lose because this person's, a higher level than me. And then throughout the match, I'm focused on not so much the player I'm playing against, I'm focused on the number that I'm playing against. And so I think it makes it hard for people to kind of plan, do, check, adjust on the game throughout the match, because there's this immovable number that's across from them on the court. So I think that kind of works against itself. And for the players, let's say that you're the 5.4 coming into play against the 5.3, the expectation out of the gate is going to be high because you're thinking, well, I'm going to have to win every game, otherwise my rating is going to drop against the lower rated player. So it could be demotivating as well.
Yeah, and I had, so much experience with UTR, and I think the biggest thing, like the biggest shock to me, was that first maybe 2 years of me playing those UTR tournaments, I fluctuated a bunch. Like my UTR went up a bunch, down a bunch, etc. Now it's become such a polished system that these matchups are typically so close that your UTR doesn't even move. It's ridiculous. You pay $70 to go and play a tournament. You beat someone higher than you, lose barely to someone lower than you, beat someone higher than you. But since you had that loss, or since so and so amount of games were given, or whatever it might be, my UTR changes by like 0.0 whatever. And you become so obsessed with, it's not even the whole number, it's the decimal. Like I think to myself, talking to a bunch of the guys at like the Hope College team, some of them are very into UTR, some of them haven't logged on in years. The ones that are very into it, it's interesting listening to them talk about the other college players. In my mind, I think, oh, this guy at Notre Dame, for example, going to play an ITA there, a lot of their players are there. He's a 12.2 is what I think in my mind. Well, I'm having some of these guys know that he's a 12.21 and that he played up against a 12.46 and their score was blank, blank, blank. And that person played up against the guy who was a 13.24. And I'm like, how? Like, it's like, who cares? And it's easy to say that from an outsider's perspective. But you're right. I think the problem with UTR is that it's so minimal of a change. Once you really start to care about it anyway, it's so minimal of changes that every little like decimal, like 0.01 is like a big deal for your UTR to move. And it becomes so like, oh, I can't lose this game because then it's going to be 7 games and that's going to make it competitive. And I won't go up by 0.01. I'll go up by 0.0005. And it's just so ridiculous. So in my mind, like the WTN thing is the world tennis number is starting to become a thing, which is like USTA's own version of UTR. So now all these players, if you played 5 or 6 tournaments, you have your NTRP USTA rating, you have your WTN rating, you have your UTR rating. If you're playing ITFs, you have your ITF futures ranking, which really isn't as hard to get into as most people think, since ITFs, you just sign up like a normal tournament. Anyway, then you have like your tennis recruiting star number, and it's so many ratings. And it's like, the problem is each tournament is specific to each rating. They don't always work together. USTA is kind of in a war with UTR right now. They don't want to work together because UTR didn't let USTA buy them out. But I just think that one thing that's become really difficult with this rating system is, for example, I don't know what my WTN is, but say hypothetically my WTN is a 17, which, what does that mean? You look up a UTR translator, says that my 17 is supposed to be an 8 UTR. Well, I'm only a 6 UTR. So now you have a 6 UTR with a 17 WTN with a 2-star tennis recruiting ranking. And since you played different tournaments, each thing is added up differently. You've played differently in each tournament. And now you have like the difference between like a beginner, an intermediate, and advanced ranking for one player. And it just turns into a complete mess. And that's one thing that I wish would improve. And I knew that you were going to bring up the UTR rating system in terms of me looking at the number. But for me being like a coach and working at the academy here, for one, it's a cool thing because, or working at the academy here at Hope, for people who don't know, it's cool to have Jorge Capistani look at someone's name, look them up, find out their UTR, find out their WTN, and be like, okay, well, I know what court to put them on. I know where they'll be competitive. But almost immediately, he's like, wait a second, their UTR is significantly higher than their WTN, but their high school coach says that they're closer to the UTR, but a tournament that they played says they're closer to their WTN. And now it becomes so confusing. And we're like, we don't even know where to, like, we have no idea what ranking this kid is. And now in between like the 5 UTR range to 10 UTR range, once you break through that wall, I feel like it's pretty accurate. It becomes so like convoluted to the point that there's not even a rating anymore, that there's just so many different numbers that's supposed to define you that it really doesn't even matter. And it just has ruined, in my opinion, the fun of competition, which is why I'm hoping that high school tennis becomes a bigger deal, because you typically play with no rating in mind. If the coach is good enough, he'll order you based on skill and not based off your UTR alone. But it's interesting that you mentioned that and didn't mention the tournament direction. I feel like it was pretty smooth. Granted, our view is kind of skewed with being in Texas. It's huge in Texas, tons of tournaments, whereas here in Michigan, it's very few and far between. So you don't meet 12 different tournament directors. It's like one guy who basically just runs every single USTA tournament here. It's very different in Texas. So I guess your region matters a lot. But
one other thing I would say, just kind of as a takeaway for the UTR piece, as a parent, I think it's really easy to get kind of consumed with that, just like players have a tendency to. But my advice to other parents would be to just kind of help your student or your player focus on the opponents that they're playing against and how to check and adjust against their play styles and what they can do, and then just let the ratings fall where they may, because really it's not for the benefit so much of the players, more the benefit, like Kyle was saying, about the tournaments, directors and such.
Right. Okay. So what do you think is the biggest challenge, not necessarily just for you, but for all tennis parents, for competitive playing juniors?
In terms of the difficulty and the challenge here, I have struggled a little bit coming up with something, because I didn't really feel like as we went through it, there was necessarily all that stood out. But when I did think about it some more, what I realized was, for me, the toughest part really came down to situations where I believed that your opponents were trying to cheat you. That was the hardest thing for me to deal with. Like we said before, it's a situation, you don't have necessarily umpires or linesmen out there for every match. I mean, it's kind of a rare thing when you do in a lot of cases. So it's really your opponent that's calling those things. And so sometimes there'll be bad calls. Sometimes they wouldn't call out the score. And so you're surprised when the game ends, when you didn't think the game was supposed to end. And I'm sure a lot of the times that people saw things differently than I did. And there wasn't any bad intent for that. But at the same time, I'm sure there's plenty of times when players, for example, couldn't handle a certain serve and just decided to call it out, as opposed to awarding the point to you. So that was tough for me. And it also relates back to what we talked about earlier with boundaries, I think. What are the boundaries that we agree to ahead of time when it comes to how I, as a parent, would handle situations like that, where I feel like somebody's trying to cheat you? You may or may not want me to go find a lines person to come in, or you may or may not want me to say anything. So just knowing that ahead of time, I think, would be really helpful.
Yeah, I think for a lot of people at the lower level, it's not a huge deal, because the ball's really not like coming fast enough to like really be able to cheat you and act like it wasn't on purpose. I mean, I'm sure cheaters happen all over the place, but like you were saying on my serve, especially even now, whenever I just like play with friends, even now, I don't think it's intentional, but it's kind of just like you kind of hope it's out. And I serve pretty quick, and I'm super tall, and um, like that's my game style, especially on like first serves. And I agree. There have been lots of times where it was like pretty blatantly in, and kids would call it out. And like me being able to navigate that, and then you as a parent trying to handle that the best you can, knowing that a kid cheated me, but I have no way to prove it, and that sort of thing can become really difficult on a parent. I can think of a tournament. I'm not going to name the person, but a tournament that I played with one of my doubles partners, and they made a call. And I didn't agree with the call, but you learn quickly playing doubles that you back up your partner unless you know they were trying to cheat. And I knew that this partner was not trying to cheat, but I vividly remember their parent disagreeing with my doubles partner openly out loud right next to our opponents. And I love this person's parents to death. But it put a super awkward situation on me because I knew that the parent was right and the parent knew that they were right. But I knew that my partner wasn't trying to cheat. Like I knew that for a fact. And it made it really, really awkward for me as a doubles partner, because now I either have to go with this person's parent who I know is correct, or I have to go with my partner. And now my partner's mad at me. And the opponent is like, well, the parent just said that it was in, and it becomes this super awkward dynamic. And that was a super specific situation, but I just vividly remember that every single time I think about parents getting involved in line calls. I feel like scoring is a different issue. I can think of a couple times, like I was saying earlier, of you tracking the scores and the game would end, and I look over at you and you look over at me, and we're like, what? Like the game wasn't over. And I know that, but it's kind of crossing, like you said, a boundary for you to be like, oh, hold on, I was tracking the score. And it's like, if I'm that kid and I wasn't trying to cheat, it'd be like, well, how do I know you're not trying to cheat for your kid? And then it just gets really complicated. So as a tennis parent, it's really difficult, I think, to stay out of arguments like that, even if you know the correct answer, which we'll get to something in a little bit, which I'll mention, kind of coming back to that. So let me see here. Okay, next one. I've been playing tournaments for about 6 to 7 years. In terms of like competitive tournaments, it's probably closer to like 5. But what is one thing you've learned about yourself throughout the process?
Yeah, there's probably several things learned about myself in the process. But coming down to my favorite thing would probably have to be that really, regardless of where you go on your tennis journey, if it's, tournaments where you're sweating in 100 degrees over at Midwestern State University in Wichita Falls, or like we talked about before, if you're shivering at that Trinity Valley tournament down in Fort Worth in January, or like the 5-hour rain delay in Houston that we had for that one tournament a few years ago in the Bay Area Racket Club. That being there to actually see you in competition, spend time with you, just to support you, that was really my favorite part of the whole thing. So it was just, again, I just really appreciate the sport of tennis being able to provide that avenue for us to be able to do that.
Yeah, yeah. It kind of shocked me, and sometimes whenever you would stay to watch things, or I can think of a couple of times you would like come and watch me playing drills, even if I was playing a lower level drill and you knew that. And yeah, it just kind of showed me that you just wanted me to, I feel like it's different for a parent to come watch their kid play on a team environment, knowing that like something's going to happen, like knowing that someone's going to be out there playing, and I don't know, it's a different viewpoint whenever you watch your kid, especially not in doubles and singles. You watch your kid kind of stranded on an island, and like I was saying earlier, going up and down things, I'm out there swearing, I'm smacking balls against the fence, I'm throwing rackets, and like you're still there like trying to like be supportive is a lot more difficult than watching your kid get put on the bench. And I think that's one thing that separates tennis from other sports, and why I think the term tennis parent is much more popular than basketball parent or soccer parent. Like I feel maybe it's just because I've been around it for so long, but I I feel like tennis parent is a thing and it has a negative connotation. But that's one thing I've learned is that over time, you as a tennis parent, I've learned how to handle situations like that. But like deep down, you're just watching just because you enjoy watching me play a sport I like. So yeah, that's interesting. So kind of the same question, but I'm kind of curious, what have you learned about me throughout the tournament process?
It's been quite an experience. I don't think this necessarily when you started playing tournaments, this is the first time I picked up on this, but your experience in those tournaments over the years really drove home for me just how much you value and respect other people, honestly. And that includes the people you're playing with, your doubles partners, the coaches, even the opponents that you played against. I don't know if I've told you this before, but one of my favorite TV shows growing up was Twilight Zone. And one of my favorite episodes was when I had that pitcher who was trying out for a baseball team, and he struck out everybody. He was just a strike throwing machine, and nobody could hit him. So he was striking out everybody. Well, it turned out that he was actually a robot that looked like a person, and that was a problem because he wanted to actually play on the team, but to be able to officially join the roster, the rule said he had to have a heart. And so his creator went and invented and implanted a heart into this robot. So he went back to the baseball field. But this time when he started throwing against the batters, everybody just hit home runs off of him every time up at the bat. And so the manager came out and was trying to figure out what is going on. But what he came to understand was now that the pitcher has a heart, he's looking out for the success of the other people. It's not just out for himself. And so to me, that's kind of a really neat picture, I think, of a lot of what you bring to the sport, honestly. It's one of the things that makes you a great coach and a great teammate is you have a heart for helping other people and to develop other people. I've seen that in how you interact with your doubles partners, with your opponents and your coaches and other students when you're giving lessons, and even the way that you treated me when you gave me the very first tennis lesson I'd ever had in my life and the first tennis lesson you'd ever given in your life. Also, the way that the officials talk about how incredible it is to see the respect that you demonstrate on the court. So that heart for others is one of your greatest strengths. And at the same time, there's no doubt that you're a much stronger competitor now than you were when you started out or even when you were in high school. And you're not afraid to bring your A game anywhere, anytime, even in the face of an opponent like that former D1 player that you played in South Bend a couple of months ago that was throwing F-bombs and throwing rackets. You kept your composure, got the win in a very pressure-filled situation. So that was really impressive to me. I think it's a great example of how you're continuing to elevate not only your game, but at the same time elevating your character as a person.
Thanks. Yeah. Tennis, like as a player, teaches you a lot about yourself. And like I can think of so many times that, it's compared by many coaches, not really by spectators, but it's compared by many coaches as a contact sport because you're sitting right next to your opponent. Your opponent's calling all the balls. That'd be the same as if in a baseball game you had the catcher saying if it was a strike or not, which is stupid
Right.
whenever you really think about it. And this isn't on the pro level. This is on even high level college matches. I mean, you see issues with scoring happening all the time. And I feel like for a while I tried the cold-hearted, stone-faced, I'm never going to look at you thing. And it made it difficult for me to compete because I wasn't like playing against a person. I was really just playing against myself. And over the last probably 3 years, definitely over this last year, but even though I didn't compete that much, it was kind of like taking a look at the sport in a different way because I had so little pressure really to play and compete because I was just kind of playing for fun. That if you're like struggling as a tennis player or even as a tennis parent, if you're struggling with your kid seeming a little cold whenever they play, really they're just trying to take it serious. But maybe one thing I wish you had done a little bit earlier, which this doesn't cover our question later, but is call me out on being a jerk to other kids. Like I very rarely was ever a jerk to other kids in terms of directly being rude to them. I can think of a couple times that I was very rude to some kids, but they deserved it. But I can think of a good amount of times where I didn't like introduce myself, or I didn't ask them about where they're from, or I didn't ask about their playing experiences, which not everyone does that. And I do that now. And probably for you, you wouldn't have thought to tell me to do that. But that's something I wish I was told earlier. So if there's any tennis parents out here, maybe call your kids out and tell them, just like, humanize them a little bit. Like, I've met some really good friends from tournaments. Like, I think of Sean. Like, we played against each other 3 or 4 times, and I hated his guts. He always beat me. It made me mad. He always knew how to make me mad and make me frustrated and all this. And I never really like met him ever. I just saw him in the draw, and I'm like, oh, I gotta play this Sean Deere kid again, and I'm probably gonna lose to him again. And now he's one of my best friends, and probably will be for a lifetime. And it's because we ended up working at the same tennis center. But I feel like if at the beginning I would have taken that approach of just like, hi, my name's Kyle. What's your name? Where are you from? What high school do you go to? Then it could have kind of given me a different look on them. And I would have looked at him as how I look at people now whenever I play them. But that's one thing I would tell tennis parents, as someone who's seen a lot of tournaments and stuff. Like, force your kids to meet who they're playing. Like, get to know them. And one extreme example of that I can think of is whenever I was at an ITA and I was playing doubles and was watching one of the doubles matches. And for those ITAs, sometimes you just sign up and they give you a random partner. Well, these guys finished playing a set, and I looked over and I was like, hey, like, what was your doubles partner's name? And he had no idea. He didn't know who he just played a set with for an hour and a half. They just played tennis together as a team, and they didn't even know each other's name. And that kind of like blew my mind. I was like, man, I thought like everyone was, at least gave some introductions before you tried to play tennis together. So if you're a tennis parent and you don't notice your kid doing that, like, make them do it. Make them humanize who they're playing, because it makes it a lot less scary to compete with, Joey Smalls from Indiana than it is to face off against a UTR 7. And anyway. So
well, I think that the player that you saw that didn't learn his doubles partner's name, he probably wasn't scheduled to get his heart until the week after. So,
oh my gosh. Okay, so what? You don't know as nearly as much about rackets and string as I do, for all the right reasons, because it's not what you do full time, and you don't really play anymore. But from what you've overheard from me, and what I've told you in long phone calls for absolutely no reason, what are some tips you would give to parents who are trying to use their money the most effectively for their kids' equipment, meaning rackets, strings, shoes, balls, grips, all the above? What do you have a couple of words of advice for?
Yeah, and I'm really, what I have to throw out there is what I've learned from you. So combined with our experience, which is a little bit unique on the string front, since you started your own stringing business. So we bought a lot more string than your average tennis player, but or you did, as part of your business. But really, like you said, it comes down to the rackets, the shoes, and the strings for the most part. For the rackets, my suggestion is for parents and players to take advantage of demo programs at your local tennis center. Also, if you've got a PGA Superstore close by, which we're fortunate to have, they've got a great demo program. So really, for a small amount of money, you can have the opportunity to try out several different kinds of rackets and kind of understand the size and the weight, string pattern that best fits your player, because there are all kinds of options to choose from. And then once you have that experience, then you can go to the next step, which is really to engage in, I would say, a secondhand market like Facebook Marketplace, to go look for, hey, I realize that this is the type of racket I'm looking for. Now let's go see if there's any in my area that I could get my hands on for, half price or less from what the retailers might charge for a new one, especially if you're just kind of new to the sport and trying things out. So definitely recommend the demo programs and the secondhand market there as well. Of course, you want to be safe, make sure that you're meeting in public places and things like that, and we make those kind of transfers. But that's a great way to save money as you're getting started, or even if you're established in the sport. On the shoes front, our struggle was more just availability with the size 14 shoe that you needed. So it was a constant battle for that. But I would say that really, I think it's really important to make sure that your player has shoes that are really comfortable, the court shoes that are actually made for the sport and are comfortable, and just realize from the outset that they're going to go through them faster than you probably expect to start with. Because it's a sport that really is tough on shoes. It's tough on knees too, but it's definitely tough on shoes. So just be ready to engage with that. And then the last thing on the strings, it won't necessarily be a big cost driver for most players until they maybe get up into the high school ranks and start breaking strings or things like that. But get string pops and all that. But I recommend that parents check out your tennisjunkies.com site to get better educated on what's out there string wise, or instant message you or direct message you for that, just to get some tips and tricks, because there are a lot of different options out there. And I think that one of the things that as a parent, I really appreciate about what you bring to the table is just an awareness that, if we have some racket handed down generation to generation, that's not necessarily the right sort of tool for, let's say, a 14-year-old girl. If that racket was really designed for more of a, full-size man to go out and handle. So you want to make sure you got equipment that doesn't, it's not going to be inclined to injure your player, that actually works with their strength level and body type. And the strings go hand in hand with that as well.
Yeah. And I mean, equipment's difficult because it's so much trial and error, which, with me, I'm way above the average of like trying to dial things in. In reality, every single company has some version of a power racket. Every single company has some version of a spin racket. So like, once you get down to the minute details, sure, like it's an endless search for the perfect thing that's going to make you play like Roger Federer. It's an endless search. But for the majority of people, figure out what type of racket you want. And then from there, you can go into the demoing programs and the demo process. Like if you pick a spin racket from Babolat, it's probably going to be pretty similar for the average person for a spin racket from Head. Like it's really not going to matter. Really. Once you get down to the minute details and super high levels of like learning feel and swing weights and static weights and all that stuff, then yes, it gets very complicated and there's a reason why people are in the business of making rackets for the pros only. But that's probably one thing that I see is difficult for some parents, is that they don't realize that a lot of the things are very similar. And it's just down to personal preference as a player. Okay, sweet. So last question I have for you is, if you had to do the whole tennis parent process all over again, if you had 14, 15-year-old Kyle say, I want to go play tennis, with all the knowledge that you have now, what can you give me just 2 things you would do differently?
Okay. Well, actually I have 4, so you can cut it down if we need to edit it down.
Okay.
I spent more time, I could probably go more. But so here's 4 things real quick. First, I would definitely get smarter on the rules and the etiquette much earlier in the process. I'm waiting too late really to do that. Second thing is I would figure out a way to have those discussions with you on boundaries and expectations of behavior on the court, off court, for you and for me. And we could say the same thing for Mom, but she never really was a problem off the court much as much. Third thing is I would engage you more consistently with a good coach earlier in the process, really as you started playing tournaments. You had really great coaches that you worked with, but kind of our approach to that was very inconsistent starting out. It wasn't so consistent. So I would definitely change that to put more investment there up front on the private lessons, not only because I recognize there's real value to be gained, but because I think it would really increase the enjoyment level for you to understand the game better and how to compete at a higher level sooner. And then last thing is I would invest more money in comfortable match watching chairs. We lived in those chairs for all of your high school years, and our aching backs are still reminding us that we should not have cheaped out on the chairs. That's my list.
That's a good point with those chairs. Biggest one that I wouldn't have expected you to say, but is really good, is the coaching part, being consistent with a coach, which it got a little convoluted with me because I was going in and out of wanting coaching, not wanting coaching, whatever. But I think of like David Webb, whenever I started taking lessons from him, I don't think he is inherently a better or worse coach than anyone I ever went to. But in terms of building a relationship between coach and player, it's pretty invaluable. To like, I think of Cade Webb, my old doubles partner, how he went to Coach David for like his entire tennis playing career, essentially, once a week for multiple years, and it developed this relationship between them two, where they knew what they needed to work on, what they didn't need to work on. They knew what was okay to say and wasn't okay to say. Like I take, for example, a guy that I'm coaching now, and he is the way that I talk to him, the words I use, and the way I act is completely different from a middle school or high school kid that I'm working with. So to find a coach that can quickly latch onto that and be able to create a comfortable relationship in that way, like I wouldn't have thought that you'd mention that, but the more I think about it, I wish we would have done that sooner. It's not like we did anything wrong. It just turned out that way. But for all the tennis parents out there, try and find a coach that you seem comfortable with. Take 1 or 2 lessons with the kid. And if you have faith in them and they stay near that level and slowly start improving, then stick with it. Like let the coach do their thing. There's tennis coaches everywhere, hopefully. So yeah, that's a good
Well,
point.
I think that's a really important point, because that one thing that I could have done better too is just understanding, what does success look like? I mean, if I go into a private lesson situation for my player and I'm looking for them to get better at serving, then that's one view of success, but that's really short sells the opportunity. So really, I would really encourage tennis parents to think about, what is it that you really want to get for your player out of those engagements with the private instruction, and really just kind of lay it out on the table, and then finding a coach that can help you fill out, those expectations would be invaluable.
Yeah, that's all the questions I had. So final thoughts, anything else?
Sure. Well, yeah, just a couple of closing things. So I do appreciate the opportunity to share my experiences on your podcast. I remember when we first started talking about you doing a podcast. You had your first episode published, I think, a couple of weeks later, and I was thinking it'd be months before all this stuff could come together for something like this. So I was really impressed. And going through this conversation with you brought back a lot of great memories on the last several years, especially. And being on the journey continues to be a great adventure as you're off at college now, half a country away. But I'm very proud of how you've developed as a player, stringer, racket technician, entrepreneur, coach, podcaster. And the last thing I'll add for my fellow tennis parents out there, I've kind of alluded to it a little bit in this discussion, but I highly encourage you, unless there's some physical limitation that would prevent you from doing it, to sign up for 1 or 2 UTR tournaments, to get out there and actually experience for yourself what it's like to be in a competitive situation. The experience that I had as a 40-something-year-old man signing up for my first UTR and getting completely destroyed by a girl who was less than 1/3 of my age is something I'll never forget. And I think she was actually kind of going easy on me too. But that exponentially increased my appreciation for what you were going through on the tennis court, not only the physical demands, but also the emotional demands of the roller coaster that's out there, the highs and the lows and everything in between. And it truly was a masterclass delivered in well under an hour. So having that shared experience was a great way to get our connection stronger to the game and grow our respect for each other as well.
Yeah, cool. There was one thing I wanted to mention. Only thing I would have you do differently as tennis parent.
Please.
And I only say this because I say it in hopes that tennis parents all over the country, hopefully this reaches that many people, who knows, start doing it too. Make your kids play tournaments on their own. Don't watch them. Make them do it on their own. I totally understand you wanting to watch me play. And now that I'm, like you said, like over half a country away, I do wish you could come and watch me play some more. And I miss you and mom getting to watch me play. On the other hand, I regret not learning how to represent myself without having someone else present. And for me, since I've done a lot of things in the tennis world, I think I acclimated pretty well to playing and traveling on my own and doing my own thing. But I think for a lot of kids, it's super hard to go from having a parent there watching, keeping you accountable, really, as much as they might be involved or not be involved. I think deep down there is kind of an accountability there, such as whatever I do is going to represent them. And now you're representing yourself as a person. There's really no one there to say anything if you start swearing. There's really no one there to say anything if you start yelling at your opponent or you smash a racket. Like, other than maybe an official walking by, but there's really no repercussion to that other than people's view of you. And I kind of wish I would have jumped into that a little bit sooner. But I don't think that was necessarily wrong on your part, because I never would have thought that if I didn't have to think about it for this podcast. But yeah, if you're a tennis parent out there, make your kid, drop them off at a tournament and make them stay there and do their thing. Talk to them about it later. I think that would be an interesting thing. And one other thing is, it goes back to boundaries. But if you've seen King Richard, there's a scene where Will Smith, or King Richard, gets mad at the sisters for making fun of a girl that Venus played against and how well she did. Saying like, oh, Venus is so much better, or whatever. I wish we had created a boundary of like 24 hours, not talking about the tournament, or 48 hours, can't talk about a match, because it would have set a little bit of a boundary to let me process it, let you process it before we try to just immediately start, butting heads about opinions on things. I kind of wish that would have been created, but just like you said, that's just about like setting boundaries, and that took us a little too long to do that, but it's a learning process. So tennis parents out there, just get out there and do it, and
give yourself a little bit of grace along the way.
Yeah, it's okay to let your kid get mad at you because you said that their serve sucked one day. Like, it's kind of part of it. So yeah, thanks, Dad, for talking to me, and hopefully this was helpful. So yep, thank you guys for watching. See you in the next one. All right, you guys, that was the interview with my dad. Hopefully that was helpful and enjoyable as both tennis parents and tennis players. I think being a tennis parent is very difficult to try and navigate the world of tennis and navigate your kid being in such a high emotion, high pressure situation, as my dad and I just finished talking about. But yeah, hopefully it was helpful. Feel free to reach out to me with any questions. If you ever have any questions, like for my dad, I can forward awesome questions to him. Guarantee you that he'll answer them. But yeah, hopefully this was helpful. Make sure you guys subscribe, follow the podcast, like the podcast, leave it a review, do the whole shebang, whatever. Share it with all your tennis parents, tennis friends that you know of. And yeah, we'll see you guys in the next one.